Okay, hello everybody. We are going to get started right away here to make the most of our lunch hour time with this webinar. I'm hoping everyone is good and can hear me. Before we get started, I will just quickly introduce myself. My name is Samantha Vanham, and I'm the one behind the emails about this webinar and other communications from the Transboundary Grasslands Partnership. Or the TGP, as we say, and I work for the Alberta Prairie Conservation Forum. So just a quick note to start off about the TGP. It was established with the purpose of achieving better grasslands conservation outcomes by communicating, connecting, and collaborating across the TGP geography, which includes northern Montana, southern Alberta, and southern Saskatchewan. Our group holds quarterly meetings with our core team to maintain communication, and we also hold an annual workshop with the location of the workshop rotating between Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Montana. So last year's was in Shelby, Montana, and this year's will be in Alberta. So stay tuned for details on that in the coming months. But getting back to today's webinar, we will be recording the presentation so you can refer back to it. And if you have any questions throughout, you can write it in the little question box. Hopefully you can see one in there and we can answer those questions at the end of the presentation. So with that, I would like to introduce our speaker today. We have Scott Thompson, is the Wildlife Manager with the Wildlife Division of Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks in Region 6. And he's here to talk about partnering to identify, maintain, and improve wildlife connectivity for a suite of wildlife species in the northern sagebrush steppe. And with that, I will pass it over to you, Scott.
Okay, thank you, Sam. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining me today during the lunch hour. Yeah, I was asked to speak on the topic, or any topic for that matter, but what myself and all the partners I've been fortunate enough to work with over the past 20 plus years is this question about how do we maintain connectivity for wildlife across all of the northern sagebrush steppe. Essentially, wildlife, we share those wildlife and they do not know those boundaries. So, just for a little context and where perspective I was first brought into for wildlife conservation work as a fledgling biologist was the model developed first with migratory birds and the prairie pothole region. I think this really paved the way for thinking large scale about how do we conserve both habitats and species across a big swath of ground that spans multiple states, provinces, international borders. I had quite a few mentors in my early years through this lens of working with migratory birds, wetland work, grassland conservation, and something that I still think about today is a quote from one of those mentors is focus your efforts in the best of the best places. So I'd like to think that's where we work in our world. Bringing it back to relevant to this group and some of the next steps that I was involved in working across broader areas, the northern sagebrush steppe, and an initiative that was first born out of a partnership with Alberta, and that was back in 2006, and that was really just an idea about how do we better collaborate between at least provincial and state and federal agencies on wildlife conservation topics, habitat conservation topics, things of that nature. So that was called the Northern Sagebrush Steppe Initiative, and some of those partnerships still exist today, and I'll speak on some of that. And this is the area, and I think it overlaps perfectly with where this group's focus is. A lot of common geography as represented in the map on the right. And that group, as well as today's presentation, I'm going to focus on a few species that we share a lot of both public public values of species, agencies. They have a lot of ecosystem value, and that being pronghorn antelope, swift fox, and sage grouse. I kind of went about, how do we think about partnering and working on these kind of species? And it makes me think back to schooling days, scientific method, and how do we approach some of the topics around those species? I think each of these, I'll work through some case examples that partnerships have been built around that center first on a question, a need, an issue, and oftentimes partners that help identify and build that public support for that question or that issue. What was the research, the applied research that informs management, or the science behind that? What did we learn along the way, and some of the management implications? And I just want to emphasize, it seems like every step of the way, I find myself thinking about all the partnerships, the different entities involved in each step of learning the science behind some of this species work across the transboundary area. First species that I want to speak about a little bit about is our pronghorn antelope. And being from Montana, I'm going to refer to them as antelope. So I know many folks may refer to them as pronghorn. So, and a bit about the migration needs of the species at the northernmost extent of their range in the continental U.S. Some questions that have developed through the years and dating back probably for a century, but further developed in the last 20, 30 years are, so what are the migration patterns and seasonal use of antelope that we share? Are there barriers that exist out there, barriers to migration? And how do antelope interact with those different barriers? So of course, in today's world, antelope collar information is the best methodology for looking at fine scale movements, large scale movements of antelope. Between 2003 and 2010, thanks to many partners involved in collaring and collecting information in Montana, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, 185 antelope collared across that time period, across a large geographic scale. And one of the publications, and a key publication from Jakes et al. In 2018, hit on a lot of those results from that effort. And I'll speak of that here shortly, and the partners that were involved in that. A follow-up to that was more recently in 2020 and through 24 was an additional 700 antelope that were collared in Montana. And I'll only speak to about 85 that were collared in the northernmost extent in Montana that relates to the geography here. And as noted here, all this information is real fine scale where we can see GPS location information in 1 hour, 2 hour, and 4 hour increments, which is really important looking at barrier or reaction to barriers. In that Jakes et al. Publication, some really, I guess, groundbreaking findings at the scale that we're talking here. You can see a map of the northern sagebrush steppe. This is a graphic out of that publication from Jakes. And you see these long linear migrations, and in fact, during the portion of this study, the longest recorded round-trip migration for antelope at over 888 kilometers. So it really is impressive the scale at which we're trying to conserve both habitat and species in the area. Over half of the animals, 55%, exhibited some kind of seasonal migration. The importance of fencing and fence density and their selection away from those areas with higher fence density, as well as movement paths where fewer fences are crossing. So this, I would suggest, really started the cascade effect of working with fencing on the landscape and how we improve that for permeability for antelope. The more recent work out of Phillips County, so just south of the international border near the town of Malta, if you're familiar with that area, north of the Missouri River, we had similar findings where over half of the animals exhibited some kind of migratory movements. It really highlighted again, and also seen in Jake's work, the ability to switch migrational behaviors depending on severity of whether it's winter or timing of spring, and movements back to spring and summer ranges. And again, highlighted some of the different response of antelope to different fences and fence density. That was published by DeVoe et al. In 24. So what are we learning? So we know, and have known for decades, that fences are a prominent barrier to antelope migration. Further emphasizes density and the type of fence, such as the sheep fence or page wire that you see in the background in the photo, play a huge role in this. And I would just say that bullet alone could be a 40-minute presentation. A lot of effort going into understanding what's the best fence for both wildlife passage, antelope passage, livestock production, all of that. And a lot of effort first looked at by Paul Jones, Andrew Jakes, and I know there's a lot of other folks looking at that question. And then lastly, I think through this work, understanding that we know there's a lot of fences out there, and how do we get a handle on locations, densities, and that is something that is a need, but certainly is improving through the use of some modeling efforts. Here we see how we applied, or DeVoe et al. Applied the antelope collar data in South Phillips County. And you see a kind of a patchwork of modeled fences in South Phillips County, represented in the different colors. And they were able to use a behavior analysis to classify how permeable those fences were to antelope. So this really starts to change the game, where we can look at permeability across the landscape where we have collar information, and you can see everything from high permeability in the green down to very low permeability in the purple, and everything in between that guides how we might apply this kind of data on the ground to improve permeability. So really a game changer from my perspective. We see similar work out of the Mastaki Institute, where some of the collar information from the Jakes et al. And other partners work on, in this case, impermeability. So the hotter or the redder the colors, the more impermeable those fences are. Again, that ability to use that collar information on both mapped and modeled fence locations to improve permeability. So a lot of great work there. This slide, I'll be honest, is, I think, about half of the work accomplished. I find myself being amazed at how many partners are involved and from what perspective they're involved in impacting low permeability fences and either removing or reconstructing them to improve permeability. At least on the Montana side, over 185 miles of fence on public and private lands, and so far is key because there's still a lot of effort and emphasis on this. A few of the partner-led contributions to this, BLM being 25 miles, that's a land management agency putting dollars into this effort. National Wildlife Federation, an NGO, Rancher Stewardship Alliance, a group that is somewhat of the glue and ability to receive federal grants for a lot of partners to do work with over 40 miles of fence work. National Parks Conservation Association, 16 miles. Why would a Pheasants Forever group be involved? But they are certainly key on maintaining connectivity across grasslands and grassland ecosystem, and really have been a champion there for leading this kind of work. And then our own agency, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. So I know I'm missing a number of players. Our federal partners, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Natural Resource Conservation Service, both federal agencies with a lot of emphasis, dollars, and accomplishments to add to this. And then lastly, our own Montana State Action Plan for improving big game winter range and migration. This is a key component of it to improve both movement of antelope and mule deer and other prairie species in this corner of the world. A lot of great work. So how do we continue this kind of great work? You know, I think the thing we're starting to address, at least on the Montana side, is how do we start sharing both the tools that are out there, the fence mapping tools, and the accomplishments. Yeah, are we working in the places we should be, and are we sharing and the successes that are out there? And that includes work with both fence work and with highway projects across the state. Utilizing those partnerships to leverage funding sources, that is certainly the value of these really close partnerships that have developed, and builds the support for grants, such as I spoke with our Rancher Stewardship Alliance and their role in how we provide funding for fence work. And yeah, and I think everybody likes to see maps and where we've accomplished work, and I think that's something that we see as an important thing in communicating success and how connectivity is starting to shape up on the landscape. So I'm going to move on to another species, our sage grouse across the northern sagebrush steppe. Again, not unlike antelope, is we're working in the northernmost extent of sage grouse range. We know that migration is important for sage grouse to meet seasonal needs, and it forms two key questions. How do we maintain those sage grouse at the northern extent of their range and prevent the range constriction that we've seen in other parts of their range? As well as how do we stay connected with our sage grouse populations, whether it's across the international line or to areas further south. Some of the work on the genetic side of this helped us understand, and this was published by Euler and McCants in 2005, was we see this genetic tree, I believe it's called, on the right, where we see Alberta and those populations as we move further south as being very closely genetically connected. So Alberta, Valley County, Phillips County, Montana. So the further you go down that tree, the less genetically similar those species are. So we know we have a great amount of genetic connectivity between Alberta, Saskatchewan, Montana. And we also know through some of the great work out of University of Montana and Dr. Noggle and his students, Tack and Smith, or now Newton, on migration of sage grouse. And the map on the right shows some of that work that Rebecca Smith completed in North Valley County in southern Saskatchewan, documenting the longest known annual migration for sage grouse at 240 kilometers between Saskatchewan and Montana. Something I think we knew that migration was important, but the distance and the ability for those grouse to move, this was pretty groundbreaking. And you can see that map of grouse moving all the way from the grasslands in Saskatchewan to the Missouri River breaks and beyond, south of the Fort Peck Lake. Another important part of this work was understanding that there are some key migratory pathways along the way that helps us in our habitat conservation work. The first use of that information was in further defining where, in Montana at least, we focus habitat conservation efforts. The map on the right shows generally that area, Valley County up into Saskatchewan, with the blue being core sage grouse range. And after the publication of the work on migration, we included a connectivity core area that you can see there in purple. So that certainly new information and a new emphasis in maintaining that connectivity between our core sage grouse populations. This also feeds into our Montana sage grouse habitat conservation program, a parallel program in our state agency partner in our Department of Natural Resources. And that program works to sustain viable sage grouse populations and conserve habitat. And that's considering all partners, including landowners, agencies, and other private developers and other stakeholders that are working in those areas. So that further was is showcased here as we look at the core habitat in blue, connectivity habitat in light blue in the center, and then where we have general habitat across Montana. So. This wouldn't be a transboundary partnership talk without talking about efforts to maintain sage grouse populations in Saskatchewan and Alberta. There's been that close discussion and partnership, like I said, going back to the mid-2000s on how do we help each other maintain these populations. The first being they identified need to translocate some wild birds to Alberta to maintain or prevent extirpation of the species in the province. And then further went on to some parallel efforts that Calgary Zoo and Parks Canada and other federal partners have been involved in there. I'm going to speak primarily about the translocation side of it. That was certainly a discussion because of the graph on the right, as populations in Alberta, as evidenced by number of males on the leks, declined post to the mid-90s and then further declined in the early 2000s. Short-term goal of the translocation was to augment, to maintain a resident population of sage grouse in Alberta. That led to a longer-term effort over the period of 13, 14 years, where 157 total sage grouse were moved to Alberta. I think that was over about 5 or 6 different translocation years. And you can see source area on the right, again, genetically close, geographically close, and logistically possible to move those into Alberta. Some of the results from that work and some of the key metrics to defining the success of it were how was survival of those birds, and certainly a question that we had from the source side. And it's I think pretty telling to see about a 48% first year survival, and I think that was up through the 2019. All the birds released up through 2019. So 48% first year survival, so about half of them survived. And interestingly enough, that's about the same annual 1 year survival that we observe in the source population itself. So I think that speaks to the quality of the habitat that Alberta, the Alberta habitat provides. Another metric is nesting. That first year, we see 48% of those survivors nesting, and about half of those producing successful nests. Again, looking at what are the metrics to determine is this successful. I think it was up through 2019, there was a total of 61 chicks surviving to 45 days. That's when they're considered recruited into the population, and was determined that was very important to maintaining the population there. I think as important for our partners on the state side, agencies, the public, landowners watching us remove birds from the sources, we've not detected any kind of impact to our source population, as evidenced by stable lek counts on source leks as compared to non-source leks. So I will say the source areas have rotated through the years, varying across some of the core sage-grouse habitat in Montana, and we do spread that over as many leks as we can. It's been, I think, pretty successful project. We also gain a little bit of insight thanks to Alberta Environment and Parks sharing some of the movement information from those transmitted birds. So this is what we like to see, birds that hit the ground in Alberta and settle in. And this is 1 year later after being translocated and settling into that predicted sage-grouse habitat, which I believe is the yellow on the slide here. We also get a little glimpse of again, the scale at which sage-grouse can use the habitat. Here we see a bird that goes on exploratory movements, which is common for translocated grouse. This individual's deciding to spend the winter in Montana and just north of Havre, and moving back into sage-grouse habitat in Alberta the following spring. So interesting movement there. What is the long term? Because certainly translocations and pen-reared type approaches are not sustainable in the long run. So we certainly am engaged and interested and complement Alberta's work that have been looking at long-term, how do we affect sage-grouse habitat there through conservation and rehabilitation, revegetation work in those fragmented areas. The oil and gas reclamation work with the large withdrawal of gas wells in the area and the reclamation work that follows that. The fence work that addresses some of the perch habitat as well as some of the other predator habitats removals that are occurring there. So a lot of good partnerships, a lot of folks that I certainly cannot represent all the partners there that are working on that habitat issue. The last few slides that I'll work through is some of the work that our department and partners have been involved with on this species, swift fox. A species that, again, common theme here, we're at the northern extent of their distribution, as identified there in the purple on the right. Thanks to efforts on the Saskatchewan side, I believe it was in the 90s, to reintroduce swift fox to the area, and those fox quickly dispersed, moved into Montana, Alberta, and occupy now a thriving population. The questions that have been approached at a transboundary nature are, so what is the abundance? What is the distribution of fox across that area? And is the population that's on the northern extent connected to southern populations, such as Wyoming, Colorado, and beyond? A lot of science, a lot of partners represented on this slide, but what are the needs? The first large partnership is the Swift Fox Conservation Team. It dates back to the mid-90s, and that's a partnership among 10 US states, Canadian provinces, and federal Canadian partners. And this is a team that cooperatively looks at swift fox management, conservation, by assembling new biological data and attempting to standardize and provide a platform for communicating swift fox status and monitoring programs. The Swift Fox International Census that's been occurring for over 20 years has been a huge success in demonstrating partnership across the international border, at times involving maybe one side and not the other, but more oftentimes a comprehensive look at swift fox status across their range, looking at and focusing on what is the relative distribution and abundance, habitat selection patterns, effects of density on some of the sex ratios, body condition, and ultimately, what is the population across all jurisdictions. Some further work completed in 2018 and published by Butler et al. Was looking at what is home range size and the northernmost extent of swift fox, and a partnership amongst Clemson, FWP, and other Canadian and university partners. And then lastly, I'll speak a little bit about some more recent occupancy work across a broader area of Montana and Alberta. So a lot of questions about swift fox. First, speaking to a little bit of the timeline around swift fox, the point from extirpation in the late 60s to reintroduction on the Canadian side in the 80s through the 90s, and then starting in the 2000s, the joint effort to measure swift fox abundance across both jurisdictions, and that's like I mentioned, has occurred for over 20 years now. A period of between 4 and almost 10 years seems to lapse between efforts on the census, and we're getting, I think, a really good sense of environmental factors that influence abundance and are really defining swift fox distribution across that range. Here we see the focus area for the census work across the Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Montana, and northern Montana. and how it relates to the international border. So what have we learned through these different partnerships? Well, the Swift Fox Conservation Team has published and continues to update the conservation assessment and strategy for Swift Fox. And this really does update species status and standardizes survey methodology, at least for the US side. Butler in 2020 published work on the Swift Fox home range size and landscape use. And a similar theme when studying a species at the northern extent of their range, we see some of the largest home ranges ever recorded with over 42 square kilometers. Gives us a sense of how Swift Fox differ on the northern extent versus those southern populations. And then some really interesting things that help guide how we can impact habitat on the ground through resource use, such as for every 5% increase in grassland habitat, we expect a 3% increase in resource use of Swift Fox. And then alternatively, the probability of decreased use by Swift Fox, whether it's from unpaved roads or gravel roads, gas well sites, roughness of topography, and then NDVI or vegetation. Some of the census results, and I love this picture so much I recycled it. This was from some coordinated Swift Fox census training that occurred in Saskatchewan. I believe it was the prior census in 2015, but we see results that start with one side on the north side of some estimates of population growing into this bigger global picture of fox abundance in 2000 to understanding that we have just shy of 1,000 fox across the population, and then in 2006 expanding that furthermore, and then in 2014 through 15 documenting some declines of Swift Fox and raising questions that about environmental impacts, whether it be weather, such as severe winter conditions we saw in 2010 and 11, and also resulted in such work such as Andrew Butler's work and trying to understand more about how Swift Fox use their habitats here. Most recent census is pending, still trying to get a handle on the modeling side of that, but does indicate we are likely to expect an increase from the 2015 census. Move into a little bit of the more recent Swift Fox occupancy work. Montana's taken a big approach, a big scale approach of this. The question is trying to get at what is the connectivity between Swift Fox in that northern population, and that would be in the region in the northeast corner there in 6. And do we have Swift Fox in other areas that provide connectivity? And so the map on the right shows cells and different habitat quality of those cells, and guides a large camera-based occupancy survey that Montana's taking about 3 years to complete. And we are just into the end of year 2 of 3. The regions 6 and 7 have already been complete, and 4 and 5 to be complete next year. So that's going to be, I think, really key to understanding this connectivity question to southern populations. And then kudos to partners on the north side of the border and some of the efforts that we see in the southeast corner of Alberta with a similar approach of trying to understand what is that occupancy across both predicted low and high quality habitats, and is there connectivity further west than our known range of swift fox. I hope there's a future presentation that shows all of the jurisdiction with an updated sense of swift fox occupancy across the northern sagebrush area. You know, I think so much of the work we do and the application for management is more of the long-term approach. I mean, certainly the efforts have informed the conservation status of swift fox, whether it's, I think, threatened on the Canadian, excuse me, on the Canadian side, and Montana manages them as a fur bearer or fur-bearing species. Also, products such as the census really give us that monitoring ability for how we manage swift fox, and actually has allowed for an opportunity for the public to have a limited harvest of that species. And so in Montana, we allow a harvest of about 10 swift fox in northeast Montana, which has really been helpful in broadening our stakeholder support and involvement in the species. No different than many of the other recovered species that we manage in our areas. And then also from Butler's work, and really emphasizing how we establish connectivity of swift fox populations and the value of grassland conservation and at what scale. And just real coarsely showing a map across Montana, generalized range of swift fox on the left. And then on the right, you can see little green polygons scattered amongst some of the other public, and the white being private land is the conservation easement work on private lands, and other long-term leases on private lands. And this is accumulation of both partners working with different private landowners across that area. So the occupancy work will be helpful, at least for our Montana strategy for swift fox conservation, in ultimately guiding where do we need to target more of the habitat improvement or conservation work across at least the Montana side, so that we are providing that connectivity to southern populations. So with that, this is probably the most dangerous slide. Many presentations have all the different logos, and I can't even begin to elaborate on how many partners have been involved in some of the work that encompasses over 20 years presented here. All the state, provincial, and tribal and federal agencies, both sides of the border, universities everywhere from Maine to Calgary to Missoula, and the students involved in the work. Parks side of things on the Canadian side, the multiple and the growing list of conservation groups, landowner groups, long list, and certainly the landowners that are willing to partner with our collective group on whether it's the questions, the research, the how do we actually benefit this on the ground, on the habitat side. Certainly, arguably, our biggest partner. And then kudos and thanks to two of our FWP biologists in helping assemble the information and presentation. Aaron O'Hara, our Glasgow-based area wildlife biologist, and Nicole Hussey is our Region 6 fur bear and non-game biologist. With that, I think we have some time for questions, Sam.
Yes, we do. Thank you, Scott. Okay, so I don't see any questions yet in the question box, but if anyone that is on the call wants to like raise your hand, I think there's an option to raise your hand there. I can unmute you and you can ask your question yourself. Okay, I see Cliff Wallace. There you go.
Good afternoon. Thanks for that. It's a great presentation. Yeah, I'm with the Alberta Wilderness Association in Calgary. I'm just wondering about that data for the pronghorn between 2020 and 2024. Did any of those animals come up into Canada? Is that, and if so, is that data available?
Yeah, Cliff, thanks for the question. We did not observe those animals moving north into Canada. The area of interest there was more of our core sagebrush, a lot of core sage grouse habitat, and really provides a lot of the key, winter range for those animals. So we did not observe any of those animals moving north, and I don't know that we saw any of those individuals move north of the Milk River, in fact. So.
Okay, thanks for that.
Yep.
Hey, is there anyone else that has a question? You can either write it in the chat or you can put up your hand and I'll unmute. Let's see. We've got a few more minutes if anyone has any. Diego, do you have a question? You're just self-muted, but if you unmute yourself, you can. Oh, I see. Maybe maybe you wrote a question. Oh, okay. No questions. Okay. All right. Okay, I'm going to do a last call here for any other questions for today. We have a great presentation, Scott. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for everyone tuning in.
Great. Okay, thanks everyone. I don't see any other questions, so I will let everybody go for the day. And again, thank you so much, Scott. That was a really great presentation.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, bye now.